So when we get into owning real estate, you and I have quite a bit. We have a couple doors. More importantly, we both do have investor clients. You from the finding, analyzing, and helping purchase, me from the daily management thereafter. Good cause eviction. We talked about this in a previous segment, but good cause eviction. I know recently some things have been in the works and some legislation would get passed. And then recently you confirmed that there was, quote, a watered down version, which I think is good for our industry, that has passed. And I think at this point now, really, what are some of the need to knows that you can share with us? And would love for that to be the foundation of the conversation today and let that kick us off.
Yeah, so for good cause eviction, it did pass in New York State. It was part of the budget. It did get moved forward. It did get watered down, thankfully. So the first part I want to mention that's the best news is it's only in New York City as far as required. Everywhere else, all other municipalities are opt-in or opt-out. So right now, everyone is opted out, which is great. Only affecting New York City. As far as what's in that bill, what is happening, you can't really evict unless it's for non-payment, among a few other things like the tenant's been malicious, the tenant's damaging, they've been a nuisance, things like that. But overall, you can't evict for just because I want to. On top of that, you can't increase the rent more than 5 to 10%, depending on inflation. So adjust with inflation every single year on how much you can actually raise that rent. And then last, it does not apply even if a municipality does opt in to what's considered a small landlord. New York State is defined as small landlord as under 10 units. So if you have 10 units or greater, you would apply to this. If you're under 10 units, you do not apply to it. So that's the general idea of what that good cause eviction looks like as it passed on the state level.
Okay. So ultimately, there's many barriers of entry for this legislation to impact local investors. You have the county opt-in, opt-out. You have, it sounds like, restrictions on size. How do they look at an investor's size? Say I have 10 units across 5 buildings, but I have 5 LLCs. Are they looking at any kind of similarity in ownership or cross ownership? What do they look at when they see someone like you or I who have multiple holding companies? What do they think of us?
Yeah, so I was actually on the phone with Albany this morning and I asked that exact same question. And they said, I don't know, because it hasn't been challenged in court.
Perfect.
Right. So now the biggest thing is New York State changed where now you have to actually, LLCs can't hide, right? So you have to say who owns every single LLC by the end of this year, and any new LLC, I think you have to do it within 30 days. That is going to make it easier for people to say, well, yeah, you own 10 holding companies and there's 10 units in each one. You're clearly a large landlord. So we'll see how that impacts it. But James Wangland, I don't own any real estate. I own LLCs that own real estate, right? And same with Jeremy Ballsmith. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see how that does play in. As far as that opt-in, opt-out, everyone's opted out, but opt-in, it actually is not going to be at the county level. It's going to be at the municipality level. So city, village, town, they would be the ones to opt in.
Even more specific.
Yeah, so
okay.
it isn't going to be on a county-wide level. So city of Buffalo, for instance, might opt in at some point. Hopefully they do not. There is 2 municipalities that right now that are looking to opt in. Luckily not in our area. It's Albany and Kingston. So they're working on legislation right now to potentially pass in their municipalities.
Okay. So going back, you had mentioned something about disclosing, in a sense, the ownership structure of an LLC. So is there a requirement currently that if you are an owner of an entity that owns real estate, so is there a deadline? Is there paperwork and a resource that investors and property owners can go and find to meet that expectation?
Yeah, so I would recommend having them work with their accountant or their legal team, but it's going to be fourth quarter of this year is the opt-in. I don't know the exact date,
okay.
But we'll be putting that by the end of this year. You do have to make sure you put every owner LLC, and it's not just in real estate, that's any LLC, regardless of what it is doing.
Okay. All right. And then in terms of fourth quarter, is there anything going on that the general investor public or general public could chime in on or jump onto, like... I don't know, like a what do you call it?
So yeah, they will
petition.
Have to do it.
The
yeah,
word
petition. So this law already passed. So there's no way to kind of go back.
But can you
petition
petition the municipality at this point? At this point, it's gone down a level in my eyes. So right
for the which part?
Who can put pressure right now in the city of Buffalo to not do this?
As far as good cause.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. So there's going to potentially be a bill introduced into City of Buffalo saying, hey, we are thinking about doing good cause and opting in, and there's going to be a lot of public comment. So those happen typically at 1 p.m. Every Tuesday at County Hall. So that's where you'll start hearing people voice their concerns for pros and cons. The way I see it, it's very close in City of Buffalo if it will or will not opt in at some point. The way the current people that are sitting there is, I don't think it would pass, but it's like, 1 or 2 votes one way or the other, and it could happen. Luckily, it did get watered down, so we'll see if it does pass, what aspects they will do. So just because it's an opt-in, they still have to pass legislation that fits Buffalo. So they could change what is a small landlord. They could say, we don't think a small landlord is 10 people. We think a small landlord is 20 or 50 or 1. Right? So Albany, actually, they're redefining what a small landlord is, and they choose 1. If you have more than 1 rental property, you are a large landlord in Albany's eyes. That's how they're trying to pass it. So there's certain aspects that can change. One aspect that can't change is that rent increase. It's going to be 5 to 10% depending on inflation. So that will be set as is.
And the 5 to 10% based on inflation, where are they pulling that baseline? What define per inflation?
Yeah, so it's going to be, I believe they're doing 5% plus the CPI, not to exceed 10%.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, that's some good information to understand. I think, just the name alone, good cause eviction, define cause. I mean, what is cause? Obviously, in today's world, as a manager, the main driving force or factor for evictions is going to be non-payment of rent. It's a contract. I think everyone knows why we're here. I think as an owner or landlord, you're trading off that real estate for payment. And I think as a tenant, you're obtaining that access for payment. So that's usually the biggest, point of frustration and contention. What else could there be? Holdover. I know holdover is a reason. Criminal activity is a reason. Really, we at Towne Housing push people to eviction.
Yeah. So occupancy, if there's any sort of violation of the lease, you can evict them as long as it's a reasonable thing, right? You can't say, because if you don't wash your windows every month, we're evicting you because that's part of the lease. It has to be something that's considered unreasonable that they're doing as part of the lease. So you can evict for a lot of different reasons. You just can't evict for holdover, like you mentioned. It is a lease for life. They keep paying you that rent. They have to stay in there as long as they are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
So let's
get
into that, because I speak to a lot of my clients and investors. I've spoken to tons of agents who I think assume I know the details. I will defer to you that I do not, and I'm happy to say so. So it's great you have the link to Albany and you've watched this as closely. It's been a huge support to Towne and our clients. When we talk about lease for life, you literally mean leases are engaged, and those are lifelong leases now.
They are.
No exceptions.
No, very
within
few
these
exceptions.
areas that opt in.
Yeah, very few exceptions. So the reason you can evict, obviously we said non-payment, but then you have violation of the lease. You would have some sort of nuisance, right? So they're screaming at midnight and waking up all the other people in the building, right? Gross negligence and damaging the property. So if they're just letting their water overflow in the tub and just ruining the bathroom, you could go ahead and you could evict for something like that. If there's some sort of occupancy that's violating law, so maybe the house is condemned, you could then evict and say, well, it's condemned. We need to get you out so we can fix the property and make it uncondemned. If there's some sort of illegal use of the premise, maybe they're selling drugs, right? You can make sure that they would be pulled out for those types of the reason. If they're not letting you do necessary repairs, you can evict for that. So if you're saying, hey, I really need that ceiling's coming down, I need to fix it, and they refused entry, you can go ahead and you can evict for that reason. If an owner is going to move into that as their principal residence, you can evict for that. If the property is getting demoed, you can evict for that.
So if an owner wants to move back into a past principal residence, correct?
It doesn't have to be past, it could be future.
Okay, so if they're moving into, for the purpose, I actually had a client that's looking to move out of town, wants us to manage their home, beautiful home. And that question came up. I said, I will tell you at noon today. So it's good to hear that, because I think a lot of people that would dissuade them from considering renting a beautiful home or a home in general if they left for a job or other family. I think we'd see them just throw it on the market, and, to certain aspects of our industry, that's good, right? Another property on the inventory. But then to my business, it's, losing that opportunity to rent And single-family homes are a huge need right now.
Absolutely.
So the principal residence is an exception.
And I think that's one of the best ones. So obviously non-payment, that's the clear obvious that needed to be in there. But I think that's the second best thing that was in here as far as the exclusion list on why you can evict. And the main reason is also on the sales side. If I sell a double, a 3-unit, a 4-unit, and the owner has to move in there as part of the agreement, right? Part of the FHA or conventional, you have to live there. They need to evict one of those people so they can move in there. So I think that was actually a really good part of this, is that if someone's buying it, they can still evict to live there. Because that is very common. And if that was not in there, it'd be very hard to sell a double that was occupied because someone might want to live there and now your buyer pool just went down.
Yeah. So when you talk about good cause and, breach of lease, I'm envisioning how ridiculous these lease agreements are about to get. What kind of barrier or what kind of, slow down methodology is the state using to prevent landlords from creating the most obnoxious leases known to man? I can hear it now. Owners are going to absolutely come up with these crazy terms and conditions. Do you think the state's going to get involved and there's going to be some kind of cross check on these leases, or is that going to become the new free for all?
Yeah, I don't think it's gonna. The state is not gonna check those leases right now. They can always be tested in court. If you're putting things there that are unreasonable, like I mentioned, you have to wash the windows every single month, and if you don't, that's a violation of release. That's going to get thrown out in court. That's not a reasonable thing to be in that lease. It's just like I could say in a lease, hey, if you don't pay rent, I'm going to change the locks. Well, you can put it in the lease, doesn't mean you can enforce it, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to be the same thing, that what's in there needs to be enforceable. So yes, while I know Towne has probably one of the best leases I've ever seen written, you're going to obviously want to make sure you have it in there so that way if someone was violating that lease, it would stand up in court.
Yeah, absolutely. And our lease is pretty intense. It's 14 years in development, and we're actually redrafting it now. We've totally torn it apart again. And, in preparation a lot for our customers and our clients, to navigate good cause, because, it's not here now. But from past conversations with you, it does appear that it will be on its way. So, what are some of the things that you think landlords can do off the cuff today in preparation for navigating good cause? Is there any steps you've taken? I know there's a few things that I've thought of for owners, but any suggestions?
So what I have done is I've converted things to short-term rentals, right? So if it's a short-term rental, nothing applies. None of these applies. You can change the locks tomorrow because it's less than 30 days. So that's one of the reasons I want to diversify my portfolio, to have short-term rentals in there. That way, some of these mandates coming from New York State can't affect me. And that's what I always say. All these mandates, when New York thinks they're helping the tenants, they actually sometimes hurt the tenant. And this is a good example, is a lot of people are converting their rentals to a short-term or mid-term rental because they don't want to have to deal with this additional legislation that New York State is passing.
So is there a term of rental? So how do you define that? For example, you put a year-long lease in place. That is no longer the case. It's now a lease for life. Is that a good understanding? Okay. So how do you determine short-term versus mid-term and long-term rental? Are we now in a position that, to have that freedom of movement, you should not go with a year-long lease? You should do a 6-month mid-term rental agreement, which is different. I mean, technically and legally, lease agreements and rental agreements are different.
Yeah. So a 1-year lease right now is helping the landlord because, in theory, the tenant has to stay there the entire year and they're a breach of that contract. So that's where you still would want to maybe do that year-long lease, so that way they don't leave 3 months into that lease if you were to just do a month-to-month lease off the bat. But on the reverse side, with good cause, it won't make any sense for you to go to month-to-month. Now, in 2019, when they passed those new laws, it made sense to do month to month. That way, if they were a nuisance, you could just kind of evict them quicker. And the whole, hey, I show up with some money at court, it just kind of becomes kind of crazy. So it did, from 2019, make sense to go month to month rent. And now because of this, you're going to want to do year-long rent because you want to keep the rent coming in. But as far as the rent increases, you could even put it right in your lease. Every single year, your increase in rent is going to be 5% plus CPI. And you could actually just kind of put that lease to life right in your initial lease.
Yeah. So when we last spoke, we talked about construction costs, rehab costs, and we've all, I think, as investors, experienced that swift punch in the face, I call it. Or the rent's $600, but the remodel is $19,000. So let's talk about that. What happens with investors, and how has this new, watered down version that has gone through, how does that respond to costs in relation to rehab and turning over units when someone has left or been evicted?
Yeah, so the one thing I see good cause actually helping tenant or landlords is exactly that, is there might actually be less turnover, right? That's very costly when a tenant turns the apartment over. So if they're not paying for as many of those turnovers, they're actually going to probably actually make a better NOI year over year because they're not paying for 2-3 months of vacancy plus construction costs. So I think that aspect could really help landlords of this good cause if people truly don't want to leave. Now, obviously, now you might not be maximizing your rent, so you might be in $1,200 when rent's $2,000, in a couple of years. So there's that kind of trade-off that they're going to have to kind of outweigh which they're going to go.
So that's what really, as a property management service provider, it's a huge pivot for my industry and anyone that does what I do. But as an investor, really, that's an upside to the extent that you're pivoting your costs. You're able to calculate and reduce vacancy loss and potentially rehab.
And I think also one thing that Towne probably does for some of their clients is cash for keys. Cash for keys is not excluded, right? Someone still wants to leave, they can leave, and you can pay them to leave.
That was a thing during COVID, and I'm happy to say it's all but dead at Towne Housing. But every once in a while, we have to, make magic happen, and magic's not free. Is what I always say. So yeah, that does happen every once in a while. But it sounds like this might dissuade that a bit, correct? Or do you think it's going to help or push that?
Yeah, that's one
thing. Cash for keys, it gets, if someone's paying $1,200 and it's $2,000, but also that makes it a very relevant method of getting someone out.
But also, why would that tenant want to leave if you're giving $5,000? They're well, I'm going to pay $800 more a month in rent. That's a 1 year of rent upcharge. Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see how that aspect plays out. Hopefully, here in Western New York, we don't see it for a very long time. But it's good for us to always keep an eye on it. And obviously, we'll continue to monitor the situation if it is going to be coming to Buffalo, and we'll probably be at City Hall talking about it if it does go that far.
Yeah, I think so. I definitely would want to be in on that and understand some of that process. Unfortunately, at our volume, we're accused of things quite often. One of the latest things that has seemed to be popping up often is forced evictions. And that's not true. We have strict processes and procedures and policies on how we go about what we do at Towne. But would cash for keys in a good cause eviction state, essentially, is that considered forced eviction? Cash for keys, is the state going to change their opinion on that? Because now it's like a legal exercise, not a court exercise.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't think they recognize cash for keys as anything right now, so there's not legislation specific to that. So I suspect if the tenant leaves willingly, it's not like you're forcing them out and they take the check. I don't know how that could really not abide by the good cause eviction.
Yeah, make sure you have the signed paperwork.
Yes.
Get the paperwork in place for sure on that process. Awesome.
So one of the reasons they see good cause eviction as a good thing is to try to help tenants, right? And they say that a lot of people are applying for apartments. There's not enough apartments for these tenants. What are you seeing when it comes to kind of the supply of apartments to the amount of people that are trying to apply for them?
So I'm going to give my professional investor, broker, property manager opinion on this. So we currently manage just over 1,000 units. I would say that we have some healthy turnover in the sense of inventory, right? We have new inventory coming online. We have new investors coming into the company. And then we're renting apartments, every day of the week. So ultimately what I see is a 3 to 5% turnover in our managed portfolio, either it be newly remodeled coming online, tenants giving notice properly, evictions, or new owners coming in with vacancies. So, we see a 3 to 5% month over month turnover. I do hear from tenants, I do hear from our leasing team that there is a limited inventory and that people do struggle. If they're not struggling to find property, they're certainly struggling to find property in good repair with a communicative leasing agent or property manager. I'm not going to get into locations, but as far as just generally speaking, inventory is low, quality of housing is low. And landlords, unfortunately, landlords and property managers do have bad rap. I'm friends with a lot of local property managers and investors, and we're very tight because we identify each other as, people of integrity who operate properly and do the best for their tenants. But that is a rarity. I think that this is just going to force people to plant their feet. I think to make it very difficult for people to find housing, more so than now. I don't see legislation. I don't see any part of our economy supporting construction. Is there development? Absolutely. I think off the cuff, not knowing anything and not having anything in front of me, I see a lot of the development going to student housing and to lofts, right? Multi-use properties that are hotels, retail, bar downstairs, rooftop this, and apartments, $2 to $3,900 a month. That's not the demographic that, I deal with. However, the demographic I deal with are the ones that need the housing. So I don't see construction being focused on the mid to low income housing. And I think inventory is going to get worse, and I think it's going to be even tighter for people.
Absolutely. And that's one thing that we've addressed a lot in Albany. And really a better solution is building more inventory, right? More houses, and not just single family homes, but doubles, 4 units, apartment buildings. That's affordable housing, or maybe low to affordable housing, depending on the situation. One is they're demoing all of the Perry projects in the Old First Ward right now, and that's going to be put into all affordable housing. So that should start help alleviating a sector of what you're talking about. The other thing that Governor Hochul did and Senator Ryan are doing is they're actually putting a lot of resources into Western New York to build on the vacant lots that we have, specifically in the city of Buffalo. City of Buffalo has a ton of vacant lots, so they're actually supporting new growth with doubles, 4 units being built on some of these lots. So I am actually excited that part of that housing deal, while good cause eviction was part of that housing deal, they actually supplemented a lot of money to come to Western New York and all over New York State to build more inventory. And that should slowly ease that concern of, 100 people applying to one apartment type of situation. So that's something that, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but over the next 2, 3, 5 years should hopefully alleviate some of that issue.
I think some of it. I think it's also going to spread the crime and push crime in different directions. I think building for building's sake is great. I'm no accounting professional, but I don't see New York being able to financially sustain development of vacant lots long term. So this might be a 2-3 year turnaround, and this might be a quick burn. But for it to be a long-term sustainable plan, I don't see it without, increased taxation. I think at the end of the day, when you look at developers, how did developers develop? They're buying properties constantly low, selling high. They're refinancing. What's a refinance going to do? What's an impact on a refinance of an asset if you can't raise the rent to what market value is? What's gonna be a developer's means of capital to do a new development if they can't sell because no one wants to buy a property with these tenants in there that are lifelong? I think it's just going to cause a ripple. It's going to change how managers, investors, brokers, developers do business, which isn't a bad thing. I'm a big proponent of change, but I just think that this is one of multiple elements to a big problem. So I hope someone upstairs is paying attention. But yeah.
No, absolutely, and hopefully, but with more growth of inventory. Let me actually back that up. City of Buffalo finally grew, right? So the census that came out for 2020, all the reports showed Buffalo grew for the first time in decades. So that's good things. We're seeing people come back to the area, but also compared to decades ago, we demoed a lot of buildings, a lot of our resources. So now we're trying to build back to kind of catch up that we actually are a growing city once again. Yeah. And that's a good thing that we are getting resources. So the idea is New York State's going to supplement a lot of these new builds. So a new build was maybe it costs $400,000 to build. And once you build it in some of these areas of the city of Buffalo, they're worth $200,000, $250,000. So what their whole idea is, they'll supplement maybe half of that build cost, and that way it's still an affordable build for that builder, and they have to have market rate apartments, right? They can't do high-end apartments. They don't need to be necessarily below rate, but they're just looking for market rate, HUD standard type apartments.
So they're going to focus on the need of the actual demographic. And when you say supplement, are you saying against taxes, or are you saying dollar for dollar, cash for cash?
I believe it's a dollar for dollar, cash for cash. I would love to actually kind of do a little bit more research and bring that back to you.
I think that'd be a good topic.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a hot topic. I think a lot of investors and a lot of customers of ours, are looking for development opportunities. And if there's resources that New York State's putting forward to help them, launch their business and a development perspective, that's a great topic. I think we should dive deeper into. And it feeds off good cause because, inventory is a question, not just for real estate agents buying and selling homes, but, people in my sector trying to keep the inventory moving and place tenants. So with good cause eviction, looming, and it's kind of out there in the universe, and it's coming closer to fruition. What is points that you would suggest an agent reference or focus on if one of their investor clients do ask about this?
Yeah, I think it's really starting. Well, there's good news, Mr. Buyer. It's not in Western New York. When they passed this legislation, the legislators in Albany knew that Western New York did not want it, and that's why it only went to New York City. Since it passed, we do see some other municipalities in downstate that are still looking to potentially adopt it, but nothing is moving in Western New York. So if anything moves up here, it's not moving right now. So there's 2 things I would make sure you do. The first thing is make sure you start getting those rents up to market rent, because if good cause does happen, boom, there's your period. Now you can only raise that 5 to 10% each year. So make sure you move those tenants to a market rate amount right away before you're not allowed to do so if you do have some that's below. And number two, maybe consider where you want to expand your portfolio. If you're centralized into one municipality, maybe City of Buffalo, and that happens in City of Buffalo, you're locked in for all those apartments. But if you diversify your portfolio, you have some in City of Buffalo, some in Niagara Falls, some in Lockport, now you're not gonna have to worry. So maybe it affects a couple of your pieces of portfolio, but not your entire one. So I always believe in that diversification. Just like you shouldn't just all buy Amazon stock, you should buy Amazon, Apple, Tesla, whatever it might be, you wanna diversify. So I would consider when you build it, make sure you diversify.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, especially diversification. And I'm just thinking selfishly about myself right now and where some of my properties are. And you're right. I think if one piece of your portfolio does get hit, it's not 100%. It could be 5 or 10%. So yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. I think with owners, at the end of the day, there's so many different challenges that have presented themselves over the years. 2019 tenants' rights laws, COVID. I mean, let's think about COVID for 30 seconds. I mean, those impacts on the industry were huge. High interest rates. It's been a wild ride these last 5 years, but it's nothing I don't think anyone can overcome. And I think it's a matter of slow burn and long-term navigating of the situation. And I think more resources will make themselves available from the state level, from professionals like our team, yourself and I. And I think as time goes on, it'll get easier to navigate. But right now, still a little unknown, but nothing that, is going to really stop us in our tracks. So.
And that amateur investor, I think that also shows that's why they might need a property manager, right? That property manager is getting ahead of those issues. That property manager is going to know how to handle them, whether it was COVID, 2019, or good cause. So it also shows that if you're not fully divested in being an investor, you might want that property management like Towne Housing to take care of your portfolio so that way you can have it properly navigate around those issues.
Love that. Thanks. Appreciate that. So yeah, looking forward to what's next, and we'll definitely keep our people apprised of what's coming down the pike.
Sounds good, Jeremy.
Thank you.